Hello, everyone. I'm Greg Weaver. Welcome to the Audio Analyst. Pardon me. Now, today I get to relate a remarkably fun and enjoyable tale on subject matter that is near and dear to me, and that I've been threatening to cover since episode 1. Vintage audio. This tale of exceptional music making exemplifies the satisfaction that can be accomplished pursuing your system building using exclusively vintage audio gear, and was an incredibly successful journey made by my audio bud, Karen Marford. By day, Karen is a biochemist in technical operations at Siemens Healthcare Diagnostics, a position she took in 2011 after spending nearly 3 decades as a staff scientist in diagnostics at Bayer. And her work, along with her colleagues there, has seen the award of over 20 patents. Remarkable. But our tale today actually starts back a few years. I first met Karen through another audio bud, Todd Wrights, something like 2 decades or so ago. Relatively shortly after I moved from Southern Maryland here to the Midwest. But she's had the audio bug since she was just a child, and she came by it naturally enough, and you'll get to hear that from her soon enough. But here's how we got to this episode today. Now, Karen has been a strong fan of vintage audio gear most of her life. In fact, in the 1980s, she picked up a couple of vintage classics, a Thorn's TD-124 turntable, and a pair of quad ESL 63 electrostatic loudspeakers. Yeah. Guys, the TD-124 is probably the most revered table in Thorn's remarkable history, even though it was only manufactured from 1957 to 1967. And now, Karen freely admits to being a committed tube fan, and picked up what has become another classic about a decade ago, the Alnick T1500, a gorgeous-looking and exquisite-sounding example of a 300B integrated amplifier, which she has just retubed with gold lions and still loves. So, when it was clear that she would have to replace her aging quads, which were getting more and more difficult to maintain, she started to search for what to replace them with. Now, she and Todd, along with another audiophile buddy, Dr. Gary Sonata, had been to my music room a few times to hear my system. Now, during those early visits, she had heard my von Schweikert Audio VR5 anniversaries, and later, the benchmark-setting VR55 actives. She had also heard a number of VSA speakers at Todd's home, most recently his VR35s. And as you'll hear from her shortly, she had always liked what she'd heard from them, and so von Schweikert Audio, as a company, was on her short list of products to replace her failing quads. But what model might be right for her SET needs? Well, after reading a rave review of the DB-100s at Enjoy the Music, she knew what she wanted. As a product that had been introduced some 20 years ago and was no longer in production, the late Albert von Schweikert had designed them, built them, and their slighter sibling, the DB-99s, specifically with low output tubed amplification in mind. The DB-100s had an efficiency of 100 decibels and included dedicated solid-state Class A/AB amplifiers to power its twin custom woofers. Now, this made them an ideal match for low-powered SET amplification. And at just $10,000 a pair when they were introduced, they represented an enormous value as well. Now, standing nearly 5 feet tall, a foot wide by nearly 2 foot deep, weighing in at just under 200 pounds each, as a 3-way high-efficiency transmission line speaker using an amplified woofer system featuring the von Schweikert trademarked ambience retrieval system and Biby quantum purifiers. This was one amazing loudspeaker in its day. I heard it a couple of times at shows and was blown away. I'm not a tube guy, but wow. So let's take a closer look at these speakers. Now, aside from its exceptionally high efficiency, they offered an amazing frequency response range, having been rated as plus or minus 2 dB from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and just 6 dB down at 16 hertz. Now, each DB-100 uses two 8-inch cast frame aluminum coned Ciaz woofers, the same models, by the way, that are used in the VR44. Now, designed and optimized for extremely fast transient response, they are housed in a unique triple-chambered transmission line base loading enclosure with a port tuned at 20 hertz and loaded to provide a QTC of 0.6. Now, the original dedicated Class AAB high current solid state amplifiers that drive the woofers were thought to be failing in a pair she was going to pick up, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the plan was to replace them with a customized set of the most current Class D creations from Dusty Vawter of Channel Islands Audio. The same manufacturer, by the way, who supplies all the amps for the rest of the current von Schweikert powered lineup, including the $325,000 a pair Ultra 11s and the $225,000 a pair Ultra 9s that I have here in my listening room. They would include a variable audio output control to match the woofer output to virtually any setup location in any room. The mid-range is the same driver that was used in the VSA VR5 Anniversary Mark II, a 6-inch dynamic driver from Audax. Fabricated of the exceptionally lightweight material aerogel, a composite of carbon fiber powder, chopped Kevlar fibers, and a cellulose acetate pulp as a binder. It had a cast frame, a 4-pound magnet, and used a flat wire edge-wound voice coil. Finally, the DB-100 uses two identical tweeters, the same tweeter used for the ambience retrieval on the VR5 Anniversary Mark II, and both are mounted to a shallow but crucial waveguide, with the front tweeter delivering direct musical information, while the rear-mounted tweeter is driven by a specially designed network to recover dimensionality and effects. This dipole creation results in a remarkably accurate front-to-back depth replication and is a signature feature of the von Schweikert ambience retrieval dividing network and loudspeakers. So, eager to acquire a pair for herself, it was just over 2 years ago that she happened on a pair of average condition for sale in South Carolina. Now, after speaking with Damon and Leif at VSA about how much to expect it might cost for this refurbishment, she closed the deal and had them shipped directly to VSA in California. Now, sadly, the COVID pandemic lockdown and the delays took their toll. And so it was that about 10 days before Super Bowl 55, that Karen's refurbished speakers were ready for their trip back to their new home in Millersburg, Michigan, to take up residence in Karen and Carl's charming home, which was built in the 1860s. Guys, even with all the delays, the customized new amplifiers, and even extensive shipping, including custom shipping containers for their safe travel, her updated DB-100s still cost less than a new pair had sold for in 2000. Now, starting on Super Bowl Sunday, and for the 3 following Sundays, Karen had allowed me to visit and help her with some cable updates, with setup and placement, and repairing a miswired XLR output on her DAC. A maddening problem that took hours to diagnose, but only about 15 minutes with my soldering iron to repair. The resultant sound of this exquisite, nearly all vintage system is simply breathtaking, guys. Let's hear from Karen and let her take you on a tour of this utterly exquisite sounding system.
My main turntable is a TD-124. I purchased it about 30 years ago, and I purchased it with the SME 3009 tone arm, and since added a AudioCraft 4000 12-inch tone arm. And recently, about 2 years ago, I had the turntable refurbished, and that was done by Chris Metz at STS Turntables, and he rebuilt the whole turntable. And at the time, I also had him apply new paint, because originally this was gray. Now it's a kind of a deep purple metallic. I think it's a color I chose from Nissan metallic paint. And then I had about 10 years ago, I had a custom plinth built by Chris Harbeth at Winsong Audio, and he custom built this after we discussed the wood types and everything else and how I wanted all of the different pieces placed for the tone arms. And so he just did this wonderful job on the actual plinth. And then from here, I have a K&K Audio phono preamp, and again, that was about 10 years ago that I purchased that, and I was able to get it for a discounted rate, maybe almost half, because Kevin Carter was just starting to build this, and he needed to build it to produce and check out his owner's manual. And I've been upgrading this, and about 2 years ago, he did upgrade it. And then from there, we have the PS Audio memory player. I bought this because it also does SACD. I have some SACDs. And so from there, we have a Raleigh Extreme DAC, and this is a completely maxed out DAC. And that was built by Raleigh Audio, and they no longer are in business, but you can get this particular piece, actually the newer version of this, and a little bit upgraded through Musica Pristina, and I think it's called a Virtuoso DAC. This is my integrated amplifier. It's a 300B amplifier built by Alnick, and it's a T1500 model. I purchased this about 10 years ago, and I actually got a phone call from the distributor for Alnick in Canada at the time, and saying that this unit was on its way back after being auditioned and by a reviewer for an audio magazine. And so they had done the audition, and they were done with it, and it's on its way back. He knew I was into audio and tubes, and so I got the opportunity to audition it. I kept it. It was that good. And it had a remote, and that was wonderful too. And so from there, underneath this amp is my Musica Pristina Acapella 3. This is the Acapella 3. I actually had the 2. I enjoyed it so much, I just traded it for the 3. And this is, again, built by Musica Pristina. So the latest addition to my system are these von Schweikert Audio DB-100s, which I just got a couple of weeks ago. And the story behind these is that I had Paraquad ESL 63s for a long time. Loved them. Great mid-range. Not so much in the bass, and of course, not the greatest when it comes to finding just the right position to listen. You had to really be sitting in just the right position. But I loved them. But they were so hard to keep up with. Whenever they needed repair, it just got harder and harder over the years. So I started looking into other speakers. I had a pair of Altec Valencias. Those are old vintage, very efficient, I think DB-104 speakers with horns. And they were okay. I had a little more bass, but it just really wasn't, it just really didn't live up to the ESL 63s. So I had been at my friend Todd's house, and he had a pair of von Schweikerts, and Greg, of course, had von Schweikerts, and they sounded wonderful, but I needed something with a high efficiency. So I started searching, and lo and behold, there were von Schweikerts that were very efficient and were built maybe about 20 years ago, the DB-100s, the DB-99s. And so I went on a quest to find a pair, and I actually was able to find this pair. They were in sad shape, but they were in South Carolina. I purchased them and had them shipped to von Schweikert Audio, where they completely rebuilt everything, I think, except for the drivers. And then the biggest improvement, I think, that they made, in my opinion, was taking out the old amps that were, 20 years old or whatever, and Leaf at von Schweikert, or Leif at von Schweikert Audio, and Dusty at Channel Islands. They worked together to actually custom build amps for the bass drivers, and so that they would really match very well with all the rest of the drivers and just mesh really well. And so it took a while, but here they are, and they're absolutely wonderful. They're still breaking in. I added some new cables and power cords, which helped a lot too. But this is probably the best thing that I could do to get my stereo actually back to where I really thought it should be, and of course much better.
Thanks, Karen. Let's take just a moment to listen to this system. Though it's nothing like being in the room, it will give you a taste of what it sounds like. And we're going to listen to It Could Happen to You from the 2014 release Sagebrush Rebellion by Dmitri Matheny. Now, here's Karen again, this time sharing a little history on her beautifully restored 1860s farmhouse.
So we're sitting right now in the living room of my 1860 farmhouse, and my husband and I purchased this back in 2004, and we did a little history on it. I actually went down to the Cass County Library, and they have a historic library, and looked into the history of the house, and it was built around 1860. It was a family, I think their last name was Diefenbach, that came from Pennsylvania to build the house. And originally, I think there was somewhere around 1,000 acres of farmland with it. And right now, we only have 4. The rest was sold off. What we really liked about the house is it had these beautiful original hardwood poplar floors, which we refinished. And also there were some remnants of grape plants in the back. So we're like, oh, this is cool. Let's grow some wine grapes. So we planted about 600 feet, 6 rows of 100 feet of wine grapes back when we first moved here. And it took us a couple of years with experimenting with red wine grapes to see which ones actually grew well here. That's one of the things that when I retire, being that I'm a chemist, I'm going to experiment, and I'm actually going to make my own wine, and hopefully it'll be drinkable.
Thank you, Karen. Finally, let's hear from her one last time as she discusses her audio journey and how she arrived at this amazing system she shared with us today.
So Greg asked me to talk about how I got my passion for audio, and so I'm going to date myself a little bit and say that back in the late 60s, growing up as a child in New York, my dad had a stereo console that he was very, very proud of. I think a lot of people had them back then, 50s and 60s stereo consoles. And his had a Sherwood integrated amplifier and a Garrard turntable. And he used to love to play, one of his favorite artists was Mario Lanza, so I heard a lot of Mario Lanza. But my favorite was the soundtrack to My Fair Lady, and I really enjoyed that. And my grandfather, my mother's father, my grandpa Tom, he also had a stereo console, and he actually had two separate speakers, these big speakers, and actually if you took the backs of them off, they were called suspension speakers, and they literally had strings, holding the drivers. But he never did get to put the actual stereo equipment into them, but he had a console that was one of the portable ones where you had your record player and the two speakers that were attached, and you could detach them, put them together, carry it around. So he played a lot of Burl Ives and some Italian music. I remember going to Little Italy with him and my grandma for dinner, and him stopping off because he heard some music playing outside, and he'd go and bought the record. So that's kind of how I got my start. And I started out with one of the same type of turntable with the attached speakers, the portable unit. And I wore it out, I think, a lot with playing records. And lots of times, I would hunt for new recordings, and I would take the Long Island Railroad to New York City, and I would go to Greenwich Village. There was this really neat record shop there that you can buy used records. So that's kind of how my journey started. I never really had a decent stereo system until the 70s, when my now husband gave me some birthday money along with some of my family, and I bought my first decent stereo system, which was about $250. It was a Sansui integrated amplifier, a BIC turntable, and some Wharfdale three-way corner speakers. And I had that for quite a while through college and all. And then in the 80s, it was time for an upgrade, and I went around with my friend Gary, who I also go wine tasting with and whiskey tasting. And the two of us went around and auditioning different integrated stereo systems, and I ended up with an NAD 3155 integrated amplifier, some B&W 220 three-way speakers, and a B&O turntable, and that sounded wonderful. And of course, that was about $2,000 at the time. And then I'd say about 10 years later, in the 90s, I was in an audio store, and I saw a Bedini 2525 1 meg amp. I had heard about it and read about it, and it was supposed to be this wonderful musical amp that worked really well with quads. So I purchased it, along with, sitting next to it, the TD 124 turntable, which I have now and I've kept, and then went and found some ESL 63 quads in New York City, and the person I bought them from actually also had a tube amp, which was New York Audio Labs NCP2 tube amplifier, and I also had a phono stage on it. So that was my system. It was probably the best system, at the time I had ever had. I loved it. It was great, except for the fact that it was hard keeping up with, the older equipment, the New York Audio preamp. I had it repaired a couple of times. I had to send it out. And the quads, even more difficult, especially given their size, trying to find somebody locally, and if not, shipping them. So it was very difficult to keep those up. And so I went on a quest to find some new equipment, and what I have now is basically the result of that journey.
I can't begin to tell you how much fun it was being part of Karen's project. While I totally am spoiled by daily life with a hyper audio system, one that really pushes the limits of what can be accomplished with audio reproduction today, I still dig the nostalgia of vintage legacy equipment. And for many listeners, it can represent the most affordable way to maximize the return on whatever investment your budget will allow you to make. Now, while it's clear that Karen's remarkable system represents a substantial investment, I hope that it's just as clear that in order to establish a similar sonic result as Karen has achieved with this beautiful and seductive system by buying new gear would easily require an expenditure of something on the order of 2.5 to 3 times as much. Buying and listening to some of the most exceptional gear from yesteryear can represent another highly rewarding facet of our hobby. While it can require patience and persistence, the joy of putting together a vintage system and reveling in its resultant glorious sound is virtually impossible to experience any other way. With that, I'll remind you that if you find any merit or value in the information I'm sharing here, please subscribe, like, and share links to your favorite episodes with your friends. And guys, I absolutely love to hear from you, so please be sure to leave your comments and questions. Now, you may support the channel using Patreon, Venmo, or PayPal, or even by securing display advertising at the Audio Analyst website. And links for all options here are provided in today's description. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to drop by and visit today. Please be sure to stay safe and keep the music playing. Till next week, cheers.